All right, welcome to Civics Ain't Dead, episode 26, I think, something like that. I'm
Pretty
Josh. I'm
good.
here with Johnny. How you doing, Johnny?
I'm good. We ain't dead yet. We're still going. 26 strong. You know.
We ain't dead yet. Yeah, I was thinking we don't have a tagline, but I feel like you've said that tagline like 5 times now, so maybe that'll stick one of these
Ain't dead
times.
yet. There you go.
Um, so today we have a topic that we've been mulling over for a couple months now. It's hard to define it in terms of a title or a specific way of describing it, but it's a question of like a platform of reform and what the future of American politics looks like maybe the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Hmm.
Um, as we see possibly something resembling a coalition built up against the MAGA Trumpism of the current day. So maybe this is our progressivism issue episode. Maybe this is our reform episode. I don't know. We'll figure out what it's called. But the basic question we're trying to ask uh, is it enough to be an anti-Trumper in 2026? This
Yeah.
is a label that a lot of Democrats have gained, for better or for worse, for right or for wrong. I mean, we've been called anti-Trumpers. Proud to be an anti-Trumper. Um,
Put me down.
yeah, but one of the common critiques of the Democratic Party in 2020 and 2024 is that the main thrust of their platform is that they're just anti-Trump. They just are not Trump, and therefore you should vote for them. Um, and I certainly personally take issue with that because I don't think it's wholly true. But it is true to say, like, yeah, there are a lot of politicians out there who, you know, are willing to go on, mainstream news outlets and bash Trump, and that's like their main thing they say. So the first question I guess I'll throw to you, Johnny, is just like in 2026, uh, well into Trump's second term, is it enough to be anti-Trump if you're a politician looking to get elected in the next couple months in the midterms or maybe in 2028 or beyond? Is it enough to be anti-Trump?
Yes, I'm going to say it is. I think it is enough to be anti Trump because I would make the contention that if you are anti Trump, Trump's the power in play right now. He's been the dominant news story. He's been the dominant politician for a decade now. He has come to define a certain era of American politics, I would say, a certain era of American society. So setting yourself up, whether you're a Democrat or one of these other kind of like fringy elements of the anti-Trump movement, as opposed to what Trump stands for, you're automatically signaling that you are a candidate for reform, right? You're a candidate for change, right? So the critique is that, well, the Democrats don't have a platform; they're just anti-Trump. I think anti-Trump is probably enough, right? Certainly enough to win in many parts of the country. Um, I think the question that I still don't know the answer to, and no one's going to know the answer to until 2028, is, can a president win as an anti-Trump president? I think that's maybe a question. I think that probably yes. The answer is yes, they can, but we got to get there to see it. Um, but the main point I would say is that there have been plenty of times in American history where there is precedent for an anti something platform, right? An anti something movement. Now, those don't all work out in successful, uh, cohesive political campaigns that lead to presidencies and whatnot. But there have been lots of kind of eras in which an anti something movement has risen up and shooken up, you know, national politics enough to make a difference. So, the one that comes to mind for me in the early republic, early American history, right, is the anti-Jacksonians, right? So this is, in my mind, the most clear parallel, because they are forming as an anti coalition against one individual, one president who they see as autocratic, right? And so there's a lot of echoes already when people talk about Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. Some of those echoes are very fair, and some of them are not very fair. But the fact that people in Congress during Jackson's first term start referring to themselves as anti-Jacksonians, whether they are Democrats, which is Jackson's own party, or other elements, which will eventually become the Whigs, that is significant, right? And a little historical context here, right? So Jackson wins in 1828 after the first corrupt bargain, okay, that he was opposed to in 1824. He comes back and he wins in 1828 his presidency, and it's a big win for little d democracy in some ways, right? Because he's the first Westerner to win the presidential office. He represents kind of backcountry, less literate, less well-heeled elements of society. So he's like the common white man's president in 1828. But very quickly he starts to make enemies, not just against kind of his kind of natural opponents, the New England elite, right, is who he sees as his direct opposition, and they see him as their direct opposition. People like John Quincy Adams hate Andrew Jackson and think he's a tyrant, and in some ways they're very right. He is, right? He abuses the presidential office with the spoils system and everything else. But he also gains animosity among Southerners, people that, on paper should support him. People like David Crockett. Okay, Davy Crockett is a congressman at the time who supports Jackson when Jackson runs for office. Crockett is a member of Jackson's own party, but then once Jackson pulls the Indian Removal Act stuff, Davy Crockett is horrified by that because he sees it as a break in treaty negotiations with people who have upheld their end of the bargain, the Cherokee Nation and other groups in the Southeast. And so Davy Crockett becomes an outspoken anti-Jacksonian, right? And so all of these different factions, Henry Clay is another one, right? The great compromiser from Kentucky, who, again, on paper should be a Jacksonian for a lot of reasons, but thinks that Jackson is abusing the constitutional system and overplaying the executive's power. Again, echoes of today. And so all of these different factions come together, and they eventually kind of form a anti-Jacksonian effort in Congress to oppose Jackson, especially during his second term. But it's not until after Jackson is out of office that they will form into a real political party that is called the Whig Party. But they take their name not from the hat, or not from the headpiece, but because they're styling themselves as the Whigs in England, right? So the Whigs in England were the anti-king party, to put it very, very broadly. And so they want to be the anti-tyrant faction in Congress. They eventually form this Whig party that is supposed to be opposed to Jackson's abuses of executive power, right? And that's enough to get a political party off the ground, right? And then they run Whig candidates for the next decade plus. And they elect Whig presidents, right? On a platform that really just starts with people being concerned that Jackson has overplayed his hand as president. So I think that's a clear parallel. Even if the Whigs don't have a lot of juice to get more than like 2 decades of politics out of it, but that 2 decades is big. It's a long time.
I mean, it's a sad state of affairs to think our education system couldn't get our country to a point where we could just reinvent the wig Party today, right? Like, I don't
Right.
think anyone would be like, I'm going to run as a Whig, because there's a precedent in American history.
Right.
But that would kind of be cool, and
It would be cool. Yeah.
there'd be some
Well, and it's
logic to it.
interesting, right? Because they all come at it from very different principled places, right? Like Davy Crockett is not a natural ally to John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is not a natural ally to Daniel Webster or Henry Clay, but they all represent elements of this anti-Jacksonian effort, right? Um, and so, like, there are enough people disturbed by Jackson's like abuses of the constitutional, you know, balance of powers that uh, that that they form opposition to him, and so that's that's striking.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it in a lot of ways foregrounds what ends up becoming, what we describe as the progressive movement, in terms of that movement's opposition to what we call the Gilded Age, right?
Sure,
I
yeah,
mean, you don't get a progressive era without an era kind of preceding it and operating in tandem with it, of extreme wealth inequality and class conflict between labor and capital.
well, and this
Um,
goes back, this goes back to other episodes we've had where we've talked about Make America Great Again, Make America Gilded Again. The Gilded Age very much kind of lines up with like the deregulation, the lack of oversight, the weird, hand in the pocket of government kind of corruption that we're talking about, whether it's the 1870s and 1880s or, last week.
I mean, the robber barons of the Gilded Age, the Andrew Carnegies, the John D. Rockefellers, the Cornelius Vanderbilts. I mean, there's clear parallels to the tech bros of today. The Elon Musks, the Jeff Bezoses. Um, we have Elon Musk as the world's first trillionaire.
Mm-hmm.
We have Larry Ellison and this kerfuffle with Paramount, Warner Bros. Merger. I mean, that just today actually,
Monopoly
there's
companies.
doing that.
Yep.
But yeah, this question of monopoly in different industries. It seems like we're right back there, in many ways by design.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing about the progressive era that I think mirrors a lot of what you're describing with the anti-Jacksonians is that it's easy for us as historians to put this fine definition that kind of molds everything under its umbrella and say, "Oh, they were the progressives." When in reality, it was like all of this different diffuse energy that wasn't always aligned, with all of the ideals. I mean, you had kind of the social gospel Protestants, you had the women's suffragists, you had just your labor rights activists, the temperance people with prohibition, all of these different groups
Mm-hmm.
that may or may not have seen eye to eye on anything. But in totality, taken as a whole, they represent this kind of broad social and economic movement that runs from, like, I don't know, 1890 to 1920, give or take.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say the way I think about the progressive era, right? Like it doesn't coalesce until, I mean, we'll talk about Teddy here in a minute, but like Teddy Roosevelt really kind of like takes the reins of progressivism. Um, but before that, right, there are all these strands, like you're saying, of people that are not necessarily allied into some kind of political movement yet, but they all sense in their gut that something's not right, right? That like there's the corruption, the big business, the government, they're all stacked against everyday people, right? Um, and so something needs to change. There has to be a reform of some kind. And different people offer different solutions, right? Whether it's temperance, get rid of alcohol and society will get better, or social gospel, kind of uplift stories, or let women vote and things will get kind of shaped up. Whatever the issue is that they offer as kind of the prescription, they all know something's wrong. They all know that there's something to be treated, so to speak. coming out of that Gilded Age era of robber barons and corrupt government.
Yeah, I mean, and like the parallels again go way beyond the oligarchs at the top, right? I mean, if we had to like put some broad contours on what it means to be a progressive in the early 20th century, like you're probably above all else looking at the question of wealth inequality, or economic inequality. Um, and as I just said, the fact that we have a trillionaire and this potential merger between Warner Bros. And uh, Paramount being about as clear cut a monopoly in the film industry as you can get, like that is a clear sign, even beyond the basic raw data of like the wealth gap as it currently exists in the 2020s, that we're back in an era of extreme, rampant wealth and economic inequality. Um, Democratic reform, that was another big hallmark of the progressive era. And again, Trump is a pretty, arguably the most corrupt president, and it's not really even close.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pay-to-play presidency. The amount of crypto schemes, the amount of pardons.
Well, think about how much wealth he's just accumulated, right, as president this second term. That in itself is a telling thing. Well, and the other thing too that there is an echo of between the 1890s, let's say, and today is the attraction of populism, whatever you want to call populism, right? The populism of the 1890s is different than the populism of 2016 or 2026, but it's at the time it's led by William Jennings Bryan, right, who is this kind of, he's flirtatious with evangelical fundamental Christianity for sure, but he's also speaking to large swaths of rural America, but talking about like social and economic inequality. And that turns people out, right? And so William Jennings Bryan has a huge movement of populists, as they call themselves, before the progressive era ever starts. And these populists are angry about the status quo. They're angry about these people at the top getting such a big piece of the pie without any oversight, any punishment, anything like that. And it's really William Jennings Bryan's message is on point. He just doesn't win the elections, right? Like he runs as a third party candidate 3 times, doesn't win. But the progressives, under someone like Teddy Roosevelt, who's a progressive Republican, they take the platform, they take the kind of the planks of populism, William Jennings Bryan's populism, and they build it into their own party platform eventually. And that's what kind of ushers in this era of reform, this era of progressive, politics, where Teddy Roosevelt doesn't start life as a radical progressive, right? He starts life as an elite Long Island, upper crust kind of 1%er, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
he listens to A, the people, and B, kind of the messages of people like William Jennings Bryan, and he kind of builds out this reform promise from there. And so when he becomes president by accident, right, William McKinley gets shot, Teddy Roosevelt comes down from the mountain, finds out he's president. He takes the Republican Party in that progressive direction. And I think that's the key to understanding the swing, right? Because immediately Teddy starts fulfilling his promises of busting trusts, right? So breaking up monopolies, right? Trust busting is the term that they use at the time, but essentially it's demonopolization. They regulate food and drug things for the first time in a meaningful federal government way. They turn around all of this stuff that had been going wrong during the Gilded Age for so many people under Teddy Roosevelt and the Republican Party, which, really are kind of the champion of the progressive movement in that first decade of the 20th century.
Yeah, and I mean, there's something to be said about the cult of personality there,
Yeah.
both with William Jennings Bryan and Teddy. I mean, those are two larger than life figures. So they've got that going for them in much the same way Trump did, certainly in 2016,
Yeah.
when he kind of seized on that same sort of quasi populist anger with the status
Angst.
quo.
Yeah.
Um, and it's worth mentioning that, you know, Teddy ends up breaking with the Republican Party
Yeah.
in 1912. You know, they nominate Taft, his vice president, and I mean, there's a lot to be said about Teddy's shifting views on the efficacy of trust busting, or whether you need just a stronger, heavier hand of federal regulation for these corporations, which I think he ultimately thought you need something like that. I mean, you get his Bureau of Corporations, which he starts in like 1903, that kind of morphs into the Federal Trade Commission in 1914. But there's a lot of internal disagreement between Taft and Teddy on like, well, what do we mean by like regulation and trust busting and so forth. But Teddy ultimately views Taft as kind of drifting too far to the right with the Republicans. He breaks off, starts his own party, the Bull Moose Party, or the
Hmm.
also known as the National Progressive Party,
Yeah.
and runs as a a candidate for them. And I mean that ultimately doesn't go well. You could say, well, Woodrow Wilson
Well,
and the Democrats win because of that, but
yeah. I mean, he does beat Taft, right? He comes in second. So the
which I'm
Bull
sure
Moose
he was happy
Party.
about.
I mean, I'm just saying the progressives beat the Republicans, right? The progressives still have a more appealing platform in theory than big business Republicans like Taft, right? They just happen to split the ticket and then it goes to Wilson, who wins as a Democrat.
Yeah, which I know we don't want to get into it too much, but it sure, man, it sure seems to parallel some current Democratic Party fractions,
Yeah.
uh, fractures, I should say fractures, between the kind of centrist Chuck Schumers and the those leftist radical commie
You know,
bastards.
yeah, Chuck Schumer is not William Jennings Bryan of his day. Um, I'll just
Yeah,
say that.
yeah, yeah,
Anyway,
yeah, yeah.
but right, so that it's. I mean, it's a fascinating precedent, though, of really kind of the tumult starts in 1890. It doesn't shake itself out until Wilson wins. Um, what is that? 1914,
12, right? Maybe
1912. So yeah, somewhere there.
something like that.
Uh, yes, and so there is this like 15 to 20 year, you know, era of uncertainty of, is this still going to be a two-party system? Are the populists going to create their own wing, which is the Reform Party, or are one of the two major parties going to take on this anti-big business, anti-corruption platform? Ultimately, the Republicans take it on under Teddy and then abandon it with Taft. Um, and so again, we see this moment where the promise of reform, the promise of being anti something corrupt, does turn out votes, does animate the populace, does actually put people in the White House for a while, and does lead to things like, it's kind of a delayed win, but some of those amendments that come out in the early 20th century, um, things like the income tax amendment, right? Which is actually a populist agenda item,
Hmm.
right? Because
Yeah.
it's seen as leveling the playing field. That comes about because of populist reform victories within the Republicans. And you could argue that the, that the women's vote comes out of that same era as well, even though it's delayed and then secured after World War One. So I think you can see a lot of like the legislative victories over time of that reform push. Now, William Jennings Bryan never becomes president, right? The platform guy, the anti-corruption guy doesn't win, but his ideas win. So that's a little, I think that's encouraging, but it doesn't mean that it's always going to be like this one figure that saves the day, like we like to think of, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's fast forward then to the present day, and just like spitball a little bit here. So to be anti-Trump in 2026, or more importantly, let's say to be anti-Trump in 2028, after Trump is out of the running, presumably the Republican candidate in 2028, unless something goes terribly or wildly wrong, is going to try to ride the coattails of the Trump movement, right? Going to try to capture that MAGA support. And whoever runs against them is going to clearly be the anti-Trump candidate, right? Whether they say it explicitly or implicitly, the Democrats are going to run as anti-Trump, even though Trump won't be in the room. So what does Trump represent that is so, what is it that will motivate people as an anti-Trump candidate? Like, what does it mean if you're opposed to Trump? What is it you're opposed to? I think is the question, right? Because I don't think it can just be the vulgarity, it can't just be the persona of Trump. That's not enough to win, right? But to be anti-Trump is more than that. So what does that mean to you, Josh?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is like this is the central trick that he pulled off in 2016. I mean, he ran
as the reform candidate.
As the reform candidate, he rode that wave of populist angst, as you say, and promised to drain the swamp. And I think it's important for us to define what we mean by swamp, because we just think, oh, well, it's DC, it's Capitol Hill, it's all the politicians there. But I mean, really, the swamp is the kind of the neoliberal era that we've been living in, kind of from Reagan through the present day, that has led to these kind of socioeconomic conditions that we have. And it's a set of conditions created by both Democrats and Republicans. I mean, Clinton is just as much responsible for, where we're at as George W. Bush or certainly Donald Trump. But Trump runs as that. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, the reason it's so easy for Trump in 2016 to kind of caricaturize the swamp, right? It's like the insider trading's happening, whether the congressman has an R or a D behind them, right? Like Nancy Pelosi's getting rich off the same backroom dealings that Mitch McConnell's getting rich off of. So it's very easy to look at this and say, oh, they're all the same. And you see this in MAGA talking points, right? Even today, it's like, oh, all those politicians are correct, except for Trump, right?
Well, because he painted himself as an outsider. And I think the point to make is, who is the one individual in the U.S. who's possibly benefited the most from this set of conditions of the neoliberal order, right? I mean, the tax breaks for the 1%, going back to, Reaganomics, where they're, going to trickle down someday, hopefully, maybe, never. Trump has benefited immensely from the 1980s onwards. And now he's in, the highest office in the world and, rigging the system to benefit himself even more, becoming an even greater billionaire just for his family and their wealth. What does it mean to be anti-Trump? It's if we see Trump as the apotheosis of the neoliberal era, to be anti-Trump means to be looking to move out of the neoliberal era towards something else. To move out of the Gilded Age towards something else.
Sure.
And what is the neoliberal era? I mean, we've talked about postmodernism. We've talked about this kind of post-truth era that AI is now fueling, and certain oligarchs are funding heavily to fuel those fires. But this idea that we don't really know what's real and what's not real, and for Trump, it's fake news. If he can claim that every person who speaks out against him is just part of the fake news media, then he can create his own reality in which we all live. And that is about as autocratic as it gets. So the postmodernism of the neoliberal era, certainly the hate and the
Yeah.
cruelty, I think, from someone like Rush Limbaugh onward, which Trump represents as well as anybody. Um, that's something. If you're anti-Trump, you want to return the decency.
Yeah.
Um, I mentioned the Reaganomics, the wealth inequality. People want fair tax policies that uh, benefit the working and middle classes a bit more than they are now. Something akin to what we had in the 50s, perhaps, like which is not this big era of left wing ideology.
No, we had a Republican president for most of the
Yeah.
50s. Yeah.
So, I mean, to be anti Trump is to want truth, I think, in an era of misinformation, to want decency in an era of cruelty, to want those fair tax policies. And I think above all else, which is the biggest thing, is to want criminal accountability for the Epstein class. And that's what I'll call it. I mean, the Epstein class, in terms of that is the big scandal of our time, but certainly just accountability across the board for people who commit crimes and do so while in office. And that harkens directly back to the progressive era and the fact that these oligarchs, these oil magnates, these railroad magnates, they were the ones pulling the levers of government behind the scenes, even though they were not elected and didn't technically do anything for the country politically. But we see those parallels with someone like Elon Musk
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. If you showed, if you go back and show the ghost of J.P. Morgan or Rockefeller, that image of Elon Musk standing behind the desk in the Oval Office, leaning over Trump, telling him what to do. I mean, that's like a fever dream for those guys in the 1890s, right? Like the cameras weren't there, but that's what they were gunning for then. And that's certainly where we're sitting right now, whether it's Elon or Sam Altman or whoever, right? Like any of these kind of business types that think that they're in the inner circle. Yeah, I think accountability across the board is what we're talking, right? And it's clearly on Trump's mind too, right? Like one of his key goals right now seems to be to get some kind of, and the Supreme Court's already granted him some of this immunity, but he wants more. He wants guarantees that his family won't be targeted for tax evasion. He wants guarantees that he won't be criminally targeted for anything after he leaves office. So he's clearly aware that he's breaking the rules, right? Because you don't push for that kind of stuff if you're not breaking the rules. And he's clear about wanting to keep this kind of Gilded Age protection going long after he's out of office, I think. Whether it's for him or his offspring or his business allies or whatever. And I think that that's just what people are weary and want to get out of this. It's accountability, a fair shake, like you say, decent, or a return to decency, maybe some like common sense tax stuff. And, you want to be able to believe the government. When the government tells you that the lettuce is safe, you want to believe them. When Sinclair Lewis is talking about, rat parts in the meat in the jungle in the 1890s, that causes, panic, and it leads to the FDA. Now the FDA is apparently so toothless that it can't even regulate, grocery store products. And so I think people are just weary of both an inept government, but also a government that is so corrupt and so busy being corrupt that it can't concentrate on general functionality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there is an appetite for anti all of that, right? And if we want to call it anti-Trump, that is an easy shorthand for exactly what you and I are saying, right? And really, I would make the argument, I think you're going to agree with me, Josh, that we've already had one anti-Trump candidate win on an anti-Trump platform, right? So when Joe Biden wins the election in 2020, it is an explicit anti-Trump platform that he wins it on, right? His campaign tour bus is the no malarkey tour bus, right? Like you want to cut through the malarkey and get back to truth, right? You want to get back to the facts. He comes from that older generation of a decent politician who's friends with people across the aisle. He can talk about being friends with Joe Lieberman on one hand, but also John McCain on the other hand, right? And he styles his campaign in 2020 as an effort to save democracy, right? He gives that, he gives speeches during the campaign about saving the soul of America, right? That's one of his talking points in all the ads I can remember. And then once he wins, he pitches his presidency as that kind of return to democracy, right? I mean, I don't know how many times during his presidency, from his inauguration on, he talked about how fragile democracy was, right? And this is in the aftermath of January 6th, so it's keen on everyone's mind that yes, democracy is fragile. Yes, the American constitutional order is fragile if we're not vigilant, right? It doesn't mean we're weak. It doesn't mean democracy is weak. It means it needs protecting. It needs vigilance from its citizens, right? In 2022, he gives one of his best speeches, I think, as president, and he calls it the fight for the soul of the nation speech. This is leading up to the 2022 midterms. And so I think Joe Biden, when he was still of sound mind and body there, he saw his job as being anti-Trump, but also the savior of democracy, right? Like maybe he got high on his own supply. Maybe he, had these kind of delusions of grandeur of saving the union. But I give a lot of credit to Joe Biden for that pitch, because I think that in 2020 it was important to have an anti-Trump, pro-democracy candidate win, right? As we saw during January 6th. It would have been even more important to have one win in 2024, right? But we didn't. And Joe Biden was not the candidate to run at that point, I don't think. But, an anti-Trump president won in 2020. A pro-democracy president won in 2020. And I think a pro-democracy, anti-Trump president can win again in 2028, when people are going to be very weary of 4 more years of these shenanigans.
Yeah. Well, and again, just to bring it back to this question of like the critique of Democratic candidates being nothing more than anti-Trumpers. That was a critique levied against Kamala Harris. Even though I think, there's a lot to be said about her campaign and the role Biden played in delaying it or sending it through a proper primary. But she did have policies. Well-established policies that you could go online and find on just about everything. And the critique was still, but the Democrats don't have anything of substance beyond being anti-Trump. While at the same time, Trump's on his 2-week promise for healthcare plans for the 15th time. So it is all very hypocritical. But the point I want to bring up quickly is, this is early August 2026, and we're now firmly in this conversation nationally about the surge of Democratic Socialist of American victories, the DSA wing of the Democrats. Certainly Zohran Mamdani's victory over Andrew Cuomo for the mayor of New York, that's the highest profile example. But just recently, Abdul El-Sayed in the congressional race for Michigan beating Haley Stevens, a kind of classic centrist Democrat. This is a real thing now that people are talking about. And my question was, I almost came into this episode thinking of that as a counterpoint. But these are the people who have the real ideas that like the universal health care, the affordable groceries, the material things on a daily basis that voters want. The DSA candidates seem to promise those with a bit more legitimacy than like your Chuck Schumer, your Hakeem Jeffries, or your Hillary Clinton, your neoliberal Democrat. And I think there is some truth to that. But the more I thought about it, the more I kept thinking of that viral clip now of Mamdani looking into the camera and saying, Benjamin Netanyahu is a war criminal. And it's viral because, one, it's true, and two, that's what people want. I mean, that is
Mm,
the accountability that people want. And so these DSA candidates, they're not beholden to the same moneyed interests
yeah.
as your centrist Democrats are. I
As
mean,
Gavin Newsom, even, right? Or someone like that. Yeah.
well, exactly. I mean, Gavin Newsom is one of the most eloquent politicians we have. And yet you mention the phrase APAC and he starts tripping over his words.
Sure. Yeah.
Or someone like John Fetterman, who was just on Jon Stewart's podcast, and he draws the line at Israel, like whatever that means. So I
Yeah.
think yes, like there's some truth to like these DSA candidates are succeeding because they have tangible promises, and at least in the case of Modani, he seems to be delivering. But also they're just willing to call for that accountability up front and look in the camera and say, yeah, that guy, he's committing a genocide. He's a war criminal. We should arrest him, even if I can't as mayor. And that raw passion for accountability, I think that's what people want as much as anything right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think what's interesting is that putting the Israel and Netanyahu thing aside and focusing more on the Trump thing, right? Like, this is why I find it so surprising that the bulk of Democrats have not been as virulently or loudly critical of Trump as they could have been, right? This whole time, right? Like, apart from a few theatrics early on from like Cory Booker, I'm trying to think of like others, but the loudest, I've complained to this with you before, right? Like the loudest critiques of Trump so far are from either ex-Republicans, right? Like the Bulwark, right? or these kind of like old Republican operatives who are now anti-Trumpers, okay? Or more what maybe they would call themselves libertarian types within Trump's party, right? Like the Thomas Masseys have made life harder for Trump than any Democrat in the Senate, and that makes no sense, right? Like that is not how it should be. So it seems like yes, the DSA candidates have more teeth in their critiques of Netanyahu or Israel or Donald Trump or all of the above than the central Democrats. But I think that the Democrats, if they've done any misstep, right, the centrist Democrats have not been anti-Trump enough, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to be a socialist to say Donald Trump's corrupt, right? Like,
right.
And saying Donald Trump's corrupt does not make one a socialist. Like, so it's right. You see what I'm trying to say? So yes, it seems to only be the socialists saying that. It shouldn't just be the socialists saying that, right? And I think that's maybe the frustration that people feel with the kind of the institutional Democrats, let's call them, that they do seem spineless. They have not put up the fight that they could have in this first 2 years. Now, maybe the midterms change that, right? Maybe once they get into some form of power, at least in one branch of government, they feel like they can start hitting back. I don't know. But it would certainly seem like there's a lot of appetite for somebody to take the fight to Trump politically.
Yeah. I mean, I would just say, like, I think there's a parallel between the institutional Democrats and, like, the mainstream media. Where we have this kind of, in my mind, fictionalized dichotomy between Fox News on the right and CNN and MSNBC on the left. The gap between those two things exists on a spectrum in which they're very close together. This is like the far right, this is the far left. I don't know if that's going to be mirrored. Like, they're both right here, center right.
Sure.
And we have these culture war issues of trans athletes, for example, that gives them all the talking points they need to make it seem like there's this soul of America battle going on between these two news networks. And I think the the tactics of a lot of these mainstream Democrats, especially early on, echoed that, and that they need to be performative in their outrage, but at the end of the day, as you say, Nancy Pelosi's still making a lot of money on insider trading.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
not like this is a left versus right issue. It's a kind of a corporate stranglehold on both parties issue, and then you have these outsiders, whether it's Donald Trump masquerading as an outsider in 2016, or some of these socialist candidates in 2026 actively speaking up and calling that out. And I think people on both sides, I mean, your 2016 MAGA voter, they were onto it in 2016. Like,
Yeah.
they understand that. And I think the last point I want to make is, like, a lot of this stuff isn't really progressive. I mean, find me a red-blooded American who supports building all these data centers.
Yeah. No, I
Find me a
know.
red-blooded American who doesn't want to shoot down their local flock camera. I mean, if you like flying a "Don't Tread on Me" flag, you fit right in with this
Yes.
anger about the as I said, the corporate stranglehold on both parties,
Yes.
and calls for accountability to hold those people accountable and get justice, and then find some other path forward that does more for working and middle class voters in the country.
Well, and this is where this actually it opens up what I want to end on, right? Is essentially that the most famous anti-platform that succeeded in American politics were the free soil anti-slavery movements of the 1850s that eventually formed the Republican Party, right? So we're going to bring back the Whigs here. The Whigs collapse in the 1850s because they start to be seen as this institutionalized um, political machine that can't stand up to the slaveholding faction in Congress, right? They cannot curb slave um, slaveholding states' stranglehold on the presidency. They cannot curb kind of the slaveholding majorities in Congress, and they are willing to compromise with Southern Democrats. And so the Whig Party collapses in the North because people are frustrated that they are so willing to play baseball with what is seen as an evil, slaveholder class of Southern Democrats. Not the whole South, but these elites that own, like it's like 10% of the population that own 90% of the slaves and also control all of the state legislatures in the southern states, right? And so this is a very small, I'm going to talk about oligarchies, right? It's a very small elitist southern slaveholding class that everyone else is frustrated by in the North. So the Whigs continue to compromise with them. The Missouri Compromise back in 1819, 1820, the Great Compromise of 1850, right? And then it looks like they're going to do it again with the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. So the Whig Party collapses, and angry young people form the Republican Party, right? People like Abraham Lincoln, right? And the people that go out and canvass for Abraham Lincoln, these young Republicans in the North, they call themselves the Wide Awakes, okay? Sounds like woke, right? But that is the anti-platform, right? They are anti-slavery, anti-spread of slavery specifically because they want to win elections, right? But they're opposed to spreading slavery westward, and they're opposed to this slaveholding faction holding basically the federal government hostage. And that ushers in, within a matter of, they run their first presidential candidate in 1856. By 1860, they win. Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency as an anti-platform candidate, right? And so the compromising generation, those Whigs, they fall away. They cannot meet the demands of the day. They cannot meet the great evil that is seen in the South by the 1850s, at least according to Northern voters, right? And so Republicans become the answer because they're more radical. They're willing to say stuff out loud, and they're willing to be anti, in this case, slaveholding Southern Democrats. So yeah, sometimes you got to stand out, be the anti-party, and I think that you can ride ride the rails in on that platform.
Well said. Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
well, we'll see what happens, right? We'll see if the anti-Trump coalition can find their mettle, METTELE, and stand up for something at some point in the next 2 years. But this brings up a lot of good points. We're going to wrap up. Thanks for listening, everyone. We talked about Joe Biden tonight. We're going to pick up on that strand, I think, next time, about whether Joe Biden was a successful president, a failed president, some of each, what the Biden legacy might be in history, I think is what we will end that with. And then I think it will be important to talk about this kind of coalition building in American politics. The idea that you can maybe be in a party movement that includes, socialists on one hand, libertarians on the other hand, everyone in between. That's not a foreign concept to other Western democracies, but for us, it seems weird, this idea of coalition politics. So we'll talk about that in a coming episode as well. Stay tuned. Thanks for listening. Josh, thanks for talking to me. We'll see you next time. Yeah.
Take care.